In this video, I'm going to talk about converting this tandem from cable actuated brakes to hydraulic brakes. I'm also going to discuss something that I was unable to find very much information about in searching on the web, which is mixing different components from different manufacturers for road bikes. You can find quite a little bit of information about this with regard to mountain bikes, but I found next to nothing with road components. The reason why I'm going to use this particular bike is because it was set up to use a rim brake on the front. It has the regular cantilever studs and a V-brake, but it was set up to use a disc brake on the rear. And because of the inherent limitations in cable actuated mechanical brakes and tandems, which have a greater need for stopping power than an individual bike, the brakes on this particular bike are marginal, and thus my interest in converting it to hydraulic brakes, which should give us better brake modulation and greater stopping power.
Let's go over the parts that we're going to need in order to do this project. Because I'm converting to Shimano controls, I'm going to need a pair of hydraulic STI levers. In this case, I'm using Tiagra 4720 levers. And this tandem was originally set up with a SRAM drivetrain, and while the cassettes are broadly interchangeable, at least at the 10-speed level between SRAM and Shimano, the cable actuation ratio differs, so I will need a new rear derailleur as well. For the rear caliper, I'm going to use Magura MT4. The reason I picked this caliper is because it's a single piston caliper and is perhaps the most like the Tiagra single piston calipers that these levers were originally intended to be used with. Because of the mounting on the rear of the tandem, there is absolutely no way that I can get this pre-bled. I will have to make up my own hose assembly, and for that I'm going to use a Magura hose. More on the choice between Magura and Shimano hose later, but suffice to say, for this purpose, the reason I chose Magura hose is because I can get the factory installed banjo end. I don't have to make that one up myself. For the front brake, I'm going to use a Magura hydraulic rim brake. These have been around for quite a while. They were one of the original hydraulic brakes for bicycles. And this is the set of front pistons and the hardware that goes with this brake. A few more things we're going to need. There are olives and barbs pictured here. Those are actually Shimano BH59 olives and barbs. Olives don't really differ between the various Shimano hoses, the Generation 1 BH59 and Generation 2 BH90, but the barbs certainly do. And these Shimano barbs will fit in the Magura hose as they use the same dimensions on the barb as Magura does. BH90 barbs will not work. There's some mineral oil here, and I'm using Shimano mineral oil, as it seems that almost all Shigura setups have used Shimano oil. Magura oil is difficult to find, expensive when you can find it, and it seems that there's no functional difference between the two of them in practice. The last thing are these little hose end bolts, and these are used for making the connection between the hose and the lever. My levers didn't come with these bolts, and it took a little bit of research to find them. They are newer M9 flanged bolts. The older non-flanged or M8 bolts that were used for mountain bike levers will not work. You must have these. And so I am putting the Shimano part number down here. That's the part number you'll want to order to get the M9 flanged bolts for road levers. Tools you'll need to complete this project, in addition to metric end wrenches and Allen keys, which you probably already have. I would recommend having a good inch-pound torque wrench. A lot of times torque specs will be specified for some of these fittings. We want to be able to adhere to those torque specs, especially when we're putting a fitting into a plastic body, like for example the bodies on the STI levers and on the Magura rim brake calipers. You also probably want a flare nut wrench. All the fittings we're going to be working with are M8. I like this one from Park because you can use it with the torque wrench to put fittings into a specific torque value. A couple more tools I'd recommend you have are a barb press, and the reason you should probably use this is that while it is possible to set barbs and even to do it well using blocks and by tapping them with a mallet, the barb press is just much less likely to result in setting the barb starting it crooked or not seating it fully. I just feel like you have much more control with the press. And a decent tubing cutter. When you're cutting hydraulic brake tubing, it's important to make a square cut on the end and to have it be very smooth edged. Very difficult to make a good cut using any kind of a bypass or diamond cutter. So I'm using the Jaguar one shown here because we get good square edge cuts with it. You will also need the tools required to bleed the brakes. Now in this case we're going to need the adapter and funnel for the Shimano Road levers, and on the other end there is a M6 adapter for the Magura calipers that we will need as well.
So as I said previously, you could use either Shimano or Magura hose. And let me show you why that is true. First of all, Shimano and Magura hose are both the same outside dimension. They're both just about 5 millimeters outside dimension. And the inside dimension of these hoses is somewhat difficult to measure. I mean, I've seen it quoted as 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. I think a better way to measure is to actually look at the barbs themselves. So here I have BH59 olives and barbs, and I have Magura olives and barbs. So let's take a look at the Shimano. So if we look at the inside of this olive, it's a little over 5 millimeters, and that makes sense because it's got to fit over the hose, and then it will be smashed down by the pressure put on it by the hose nut to make a tight seal. The hose may also be expanded a little bit by the insertion of the barb. Now about that barb. So I get 2.51 on this BH59 barb. That's across the outsides. And getting into the lands here, the groove as best as I can, about 2.3. Now on the other hand, let's take a look at the Magura hoses, Magura fittings. Start with the Magura olive. This one comes up to be a little greater than 5 millimeters. So it's more so, but again, this has to do with how Magura configures their fittings. This olive is still designed to go over 5 millimeter hose, and I'm using it with Magura hose in this case. And now, most importantly, let's look at the barb. So right there, I get 2.50. That is a negligible and inconsequential difference over the Shimano 2.51 that I measured earlier. And inside the grooves, best I can measure it, it's a little less, about 2.2. So basically, when it comes down to the choice of barbs and olives, I decided that given how close the dimensions of the actual hose are, and in fact of the actual fittings, my decision was to use Magura olives and barbs at the Magura end, that is at the brake caliper end, and Shimano olives and barbs at the lever end, since that is the Shimano end. One last thing while we're here. I said before about the hose is one of the reasons why I wanted to use this Shigura hose is because it comes with this nice factory banjo end, and I don't have to make up my own banjo end. We're going to install this on the caliper shortly. Quick note, in order to get this to seal, there are a couple of O-rings that need to be installed. Has to be one on each side. And be careful not to lose these. So, on that side, on the inside. Now, there's two different fixing bolts that Magura used over the years. Older Magura calipers use this long silver bolt, but the one I have is a newer one. The newer one just uses a bolt that's the same as the bleed screw. All right, let's go to install it on the bike. All right, so I'm starting here. I'm going to attach this caliper. First thing that we need to do is go ahead and attach that banjo fitting. And I'm just going to provisionally attach it here while I route the hose to the front control unit. So here's my hose with the two O-rings I had from earlier. And what I'm going to do, take that Magura supplied screw, thread it carefully in here. O-rings are in place on both sides. Now, this is designed to be positionable to make the routing as easy as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put these fixing bolts in just kind of finger tight right now, since I'm going to end up taking this off again when I go to bleed it. Let me see. Centering actually looks decent on this right now. Close enough for my purposes. Okay, and now, as I said, we can go ahead and position this to make a routing as easy as possible. The torque is not much on these. It's supposed to be only 3 newton meters, because it's not really the torque of the bolts that's holding it in. It's those O-rings being compressed. So I'd say if we're going to route this like this, we probably want to have it like that. I'm going to go ahead and put that into torque. All right, so I've attached the hose provisionally just with a few pieces of tape. I'll replace these pieces of tape with proper cable clips when we get this assembly done. So now we're here on the lever end. I've taken the dust cover out of the lever, and what we're going to need to do is to route this in here and make the termination at the Shimano end. So we need to make sure that the hose won't kink when we have it at full lock. About like that would be appropriate. It's okay to leave a little bit extra. I can always find a place to tack up extra, but that looks like about the right length for me. It'll go about 3/4 of an inch in here, so down to the bottom of this. So we need to make the cable cut right there. Use my favorite cable cutter. All right, finishing up this end. Let's take our Shimano 9 flange nut, thread that over. Shimano BH59 olive, thread that over. Now it's time to press the barb. This process will be made easier if we can go ahead and take a little bit of this Shimano mineral oil and just put a dot of it on the end of the hose and on the barb. Doesn't take much, just a little bit, just to lubricate it as we put it into the barb press. So in the barb press, back it off all the way, set the barb on it, place the barb through the jaws of the clamp, tighten the clamp down, and make sure the barb gets started. And now we just screw it down to press the barb in. Much easier than using blocks. Barb seated all the way. Take this out. I'm gonna put the top back on my mineral oil here. And lastly, the whole assembly needs to go together into this lever body. Now, to put this in here, I'm going to use that flare nut wrench from earlier. Get this started straight. Now right here on the side of the lever body it says 5 to 6 Newton meters, which is a fair amount of torque. Definitely don't want to exceed that amount, but probably do want to use that so I get a leak-free connection. So in order to do that, I'm going to again use the torque wrench. We're starting to seat the olive. In order to use our torque wrench with this flare nut wrench, it needs to be at 90 degrees. 90 degrees here, the torque wrench to the body of the lever. That's in order to get an accurate torque reading. If we don't have that, we won't have a meaningful torque reading.
So now it's time to fill and bleed the system. I'm not going to cover this in depth as it's covered well in other videos that are available online. Only thing I would note is that unlike bleeding a Shimano only system, you will need to use the Shigura M6 threaded adapter on the caliper end in order to bleed this system. Another thing is when you do go to replace the Shigura bleed screw, make sure that you use the O-ring underneath it. There's a recess in the caliper for that O-ring. The O-ring was in a separate package with my caliper, but that is needed in order to get a good seal with the system.
So I want to talk about an issue that I think may have only happened because I tried to do this using HS22. And if I were doing this all over again, I would probably use HS33 or HS11 rather than HS22. because I don't think that they would require me to do the same thing that I'm doing right now. But if you look at these HS calipers, there's basically two pieces to them. There's this straddle cable, which is done with two barb fittings. These two barb fittings have actually different threads on either side. And so replacing this straddle cable means using this same type of hose. And if you look at this hose, it's different than what I used previously. This is the old style Magura hose. And you can see the end of this. What I have here on my left hand is the newer Magura disc caliper hose. And what I have on the right over here is the older Magura rim brake hose. And if you look at them, they're slightly different. This is the hose that I compared earlier and said it's very similar to Shimano BH59. It's about 5 mil on the outside and about roughly 2.2 on the inside. This hose, on the other hand, the older hose that was used with the hydraulic rim brakes is different. It's a somewhat larger diameter on the outside, slightly maybe. But what it is definitely is a significantly larger diameter on the inside, about 2.75. So the old hose that was used on the rim brakes, you should not attempt to set a barb in here. And for that reason, I don't want to use this hose in the connection that goes from the calipers up to my Shimano lever. Instead, what I'm going to do is do something that I think is already done on all HS33 levers, which is I'm going to use tubing that was made for having a barb and olive type configuration rather than just being forced over a barb the way that these fittings are. And in particular here, just to prove my point that the Magura hose and BH59 are in practice interchangeable, this is actually Shimano BH59 hose, which I'm going to use to do this job. Now, because this is at the Magura end of the caliper, we're going to use Magura fittings, including a Magura barb and a Magura olive. We're also going to use a Magura nut. And the way that's going to work, we're going to thread that on. We're going to take the barb press, back it all the way out, set the barb on it, clamp the hose in place, all right. Magura barb has been set in Shimano hose. Thread on the Magura olive. So we have a Magura nut, Magura olive going into a Magura caliper. Get this started. Okay, once that comes snug, use my flare nut wrench to tighten it. This is a very tight fit, because it's right up against the other nut. In fact, I'm probably not going to be able to finish this with my flare nut wrench.
because it is very, very snug with the other nut. Well, can't always do it. Anyhow, I'm going to torque this one down, and so what we'll have is Shimano hose, in this case, going into Magura fittings into Magura caliper. The other end, of course, will be used for Shimano fittings and the Shimano STI lever. It's now time to finish up this installation. I have installed the Magura rim brake on the cantilever studs, and I'm not really going to go over this procedure. It's quite easy. There's also a very good video from Magura that details it probably better than I could. The bottom line is you simply fit these adapters in the prescribed order, torque the bolts down after aligning the pads with the rim. Here's my BH59 hose that I previously fit to this caliper. Last thing is to simply run it to the lever. So in order to do that, it's a similar procedure as before. Leave a little bit of slack here so it's not super tight. Cut it about there. All right. So about like that. And as previously, same procedure. Thread on our M9 threaded nut. Thread on the olive. And now we're just gonna dab this end in our mineral oil. Just to lubricate things while we set the spar. BH59 barb going on to BH59 hose. So line those ends up. That. All right. Pull our olive down and transfer a little bit of this oil to the olive just to prevent galling on the edge of the nut. Same procedure as before. Use my wrench to tighten this down. And then to get my torque spec correct, use the crowfoot feature on here. A 90-degree angle. There's our 6 Newton meters. And there you have it. Now time to fill and bleed the brake.
Filling and bleeding the hydraulic rim brake is very similar to the same process that you would use for any disc caliper brake, and similar to the process we used on the rear. It even uses the same M6 Magura fitting on the caliper side. Of course, I'll need my Shimano funnel on the lever side. And what I'm doing in here is a process that's worked well for me, which is to pull fluid back and forth between the reservoir at the top and the syringe at the bottom. You can pretty effectively get the air out of this and trap it in the top of the syringe away from the caliper and just let it bubble out on the funnel on the other side.
So finally, with all that done, you may be wondering, how do these brakes work? The rear caliper is really not that much different than the cable actuated caliper that I had previously. The front caliper, I will say, this hydraulic rim brake, feels great. I definitely think that there is an increase in braking power over the V brake that was there previously. Now, some of you may also be wondering at this point, how did I know that this was going to work? Because it seems like I'm just putting together random components from different manufacturers and I'm mixing road and mountain. What gave me any kind of confidence that it was going to work? And you may also be wondering, what about a hybrid setup that I'm contemplating? Will that work? Let me see if I can address both of those at once. So as far as to how and why it works and why hybrid setups would work, in this case, remember that Magura was first to market with these hydraulic brakes, and when Shimano came out a few years later with their own products, they largely simply adopted all of the parameters Magura was already using as their own standard. In particular, they used mineral oil as the fluid, and that would be one thing that would be straight off the bat. Any hybrid setup you're using has to have the same fluid chemistry, either both mineral oil or both DOT fluid and the same type of DOT fluid. Any mismatch in that, and I would absolutely not recommend even attempting it. Another thing is that Magura, in all their dual piston calipers, have been using 22 millimeter bores. Shimano adopted that and began using it in their calipers as well. And that's true, including these hydraulic rim brakes. It's also true in that MT4, and it's true of the Tiagra flat mount calipers, which these control levers were originally designed to work with. All of them have 22 millimeter bores. And it's not necessarily that they have the exact bore diameter, but at least the piston area would have to be either the same or very close in order for a hybrid setup to work. Because anything other than that, and you're either going to get not enough pad travel or too much pad travel, or your lever will bottom out, or something else will happen that is undesirable if the piston's area isn't pretty close to the same. The last thing that makes this possible and would be a consideration in any hybrid setup is hoses and fittings. As I've shown previously, the Shimano BH59 hose and the Magura 2.2 disc tube are, for all practical purposes, interchangeable. And that allowed me to use Magura fittings on the Magura side and Shimano fittings on the Shimano side. If you were contemplating a setup and the manufacturers used broadly different standards for the diameters of their barbs and or hose, then that would definitely be a concern, because it would raise the possibility that you wouldn't be able to use that manufacturer's fittings on that end. And in that case, you can't guarantee a leak-free setup. So those are the considerations, I would say, in any kind of hybrid setup. And you can see that they're all met, which is why this one works.